On Saturday, June 24, 1950, President Harry Truman was working in his library when the phone rang at 9:20 p.m. His Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, was on the line. "Mr. President, I have some very bad news. The North Koreans have invaded South Korea." These events violated a compromise made on August 11, 1945, by the United States and the Soviet Union. This superpower compromise created a conflict that exploded into years of warfare for the Korean people and caused more than 4 million casualties around the world, leaving behind a devastated, divided Korean peninsula.
The 38th parallel is where the demilitarized zone is, which is in actuality the most heavily patrolled area probably in the world.
After years of conflict in the Russo-Japanese War, the EOLSA Treaty was signed by Russia and Japan, making Korea a protectorate of Japan. Although Japan modernized the Korean infrastructure by building streets and railroad systems, they ruled Korea with an iron fist in hope of destroying the Korean culture and language. Finally, on March 1, 1919, the Koreans rebelled, marking one of their first independent movements against Japan. However, this attempt was suppressed as thousands of Koreans were maimed, killed, or imprisoned. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, the Koreans continued to live under cruel Japanese oppression. During World War II, Japan used human resources from Korea to feed its war machine. Hundreds of Korean men were drafted into the Japanese army. Finally, with the defeat of Japan during World War II, Korea came under divided rule of the United States and the Soviet Union. Allies during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union became enemies after the war. Conflict developed over their deep ideological differences, as the Soviet Union was founded on communism and the United States on capitalism. As their political and economic differences grew, a 46-year conflict developed, known as the Cold War. In a panic over the imminent spread of communism, in July 1945, the U.S. War Department ordered Army Colonels Dean Rusk and Charles H. Bonesteel III to design a plan for occupation by the two superpowers, setting in motion a compromise. They proposed a demilitarized zone at the 38th parallel, with the Soviets handling the post-war occupation duties in North Korea, a heavy industrial mountainous region. The United States occupied the South with its productive rice fields. The United Nations tried to stop the Soviets and the Americans from separating Korea, but the two superpowers went ahead with the compromise. Almost all Koreans were against the separation. North Koreans wanted the entire country to be under communist rule, while South Korea wanted their own government since other countries had ruled them in the past. In 1948, the split became official. On August 15th, the Republic of Korea was established in the South under the leadership of Syngman Rhee. A month later, the North became the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The Soviets appointed Kim Il-sung, a supporter of communism, as the leader. Tensions intensified, with each side threatening the other. Fearing an attack by the South on the North would ignite World War III, President Truman withdrew all weaponry he had from South Korea. On June 25, 1950, at approximately 4 a.m., the North Korean army led by Kim Il-sung attacked South Korea with the powerful Soviet tanks from World War II. At 11 a.m., North Korea declared war on South Korea. But South Korea did not stand a chance since all U.S. weaponry had been withdrawn. 3 days later, Kim's forces captured Seoul, the capital of South Korea. They moved on to the city of Incheon. Along the way, they killed everyone in sight. The South Koreans were defenseless. President Truman was informed 9 hours after the first attack. 2 days after the invasion, Truman gave his military support to South Korea. On July 1, 1950, the first U.S. troops entered South Korea. As the conflict continued, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution calling for an end to hostilities. Under the leadership of U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, a joint command of 16 nations agreed to assist the South Koreans. On September 15, 1950, UN troops led by MacArthur landed in Incheon, cutting the North Korean army in half. This forced them to flee back to North Korea. Meanwhile, the leader of Communist China, Mao Zedong, watched the events in Korea with great concern. Fearing that the United States would extend the war into China, Mao believed that Chinese forces needed to support North Korea and drive U.S. and UN forces out of Korea. In early November, the Communist Chinese forces sent 1 million well-trained, well-equipped men across the Yalu River to battle U.S. and UN forces, who were outnumbered 10-1. The Chinese were welcomed greatly in North Korea and were announced as saviors of the devastated cities and landscapes. However, reinforcements arrived in January 1951, and by the end of March, U.S. and UN forces retook Seoul and Incheon. Realizing the value of occupying Seoul with the help of Chinese forces, the North Koreans captured Seoul for a second time. But once again, the UN forces forced the North Koreans out, and the North Koreans would never invade Seoul again. However, battles and skirmishes continued along the 38th parallel. Surprisingly, on June 23, 1952, the Soviet Union wanted to start armistice talks.
The Soviet people believed that as a first step, discussions should be started between the belligerents for a ceasefire and an armistice, providing for the mutual withdrawal of forces from the 38th parallel.
On July 10th, representatives from both sides met for talks at Kaesong, a city just south of the 38th parallel. Talks dragged on for over a year. On April 26th, the Korean War armistice was reached, re-establishing the 38th parallel as a demilitarized zone that would continue to separate North and South Korea. This was the same division that had been established in the Compromise of 1945. Although this armistice stopped the hot war, it escalated the Cold War between the two superpowers. Finally, in July 1953, the Korean War ended. Left in its wake were 4 million military and civilian casualties. Korea suffered horrors, unprecedented in their 5,000-year history. However, many were able to survive.
이제 도망가는 패잔병들이 삥 둘러서서 총으로 쏠라고 그랬어요. 우리를 다 죽인 청년이 그 신문 기자였었는데 그 청년이 유엔 미군이 좋아서 우리는 다시 이 가족처럼 이렇게 동무 임무를 잘 수행하기 바란다고.
Since most of the war was fought in the South, the people of South Korea suffered the most. As a whole, the standard of living was lowered. Crop failure, destruction, lack of fertilizer caused by the war destroyed the Korean economy. The price of rice, their most important staple, was inflated so that many South Koreans could not afford to buy it. The war had dramatic effects on their culture and way of life, as the infrastructure was in shambles, and more than 10 million people lost their homes and possessions. Because of the demilitarized zone, families were separated, many would never see their loved ones again. Tragically, more than 100,000 children were orphaned. They were second-class citizens in their own land, as many felt they were socially unacceptable to the foreigners that occupied their country. And politically, North Korea is still communist and South Korea is capitalist. This boundary still exists today, demonstrating that the compromise of the two superpowers was an act of futility, as the split was never resolved. Both sides have made their own compromise, accepting that Korea will not be unified. Despite South Korea more than doubling the population of the North, the South Koreans have a lower unemployment rate and a higher standard of living. Because of the differences between the two governments, the North Koreans want to move to the South, but because of Kim Jong-il's government, they are not allowed to.
But right now, their situation is really bad. The United Nations reported about 3 million people starved to death.
And the entire world holds its breath as North Korea, under the leadership of Kim Jong-il, flaunts its nuclear weapons and builds political alliances with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the leader of Iran. The 38th Parallel Compromise deepened the battles of the Cold War, demonstrating how outside governments can tear a unified country apart. The Korean War is often referred to as the Forgotten War. Let's just hope that the leaders of Russia and the United States remember the history of the Forgotten War and the world impact of compromise at the 38th Parallel.